The sun was setting over Georgetown, painting the historic Washington, D.C. neighborhood in soft orange hues. The streets were quieting down as the evening traffic thinned out, with just a few cars making their way through the tree-lined avenues. Among them was a sleek, black Audi with government plates, its windows tinted just a shade darker than usual. Behind the wheel sat a man who'd spent the last 8 hours in a windowless room discussing matters of national security. He was tired but alert, his mind still processing the classified briefing he'd just left. As one of the CIA's most experienced intelligence officers, he'd learned to stay aware of his surroundings, even on these routine drives home. The day had been long, filled with the kind of high-stakes discussions that most people only see in movies. He'd been analyzing potential threats to American interests overseas, coordinating with field agents, and planning operations that would never make the headlines. Now, all he wanted was to get home, kick off his shoes, and maybe catch the end of the basketball game. But life had other plans. In his rearview mirror, red and blue lights suddenly flashed to life. The police cruiser had been following so quietly, he hadn't even noticed it. The intelligence officer checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His registration was current, and he knew his brake lights were working. Still, he did what any responsible citizen would do. He turned on his hazard lights and carefully pulled over to the side of the road. His heart rate picked up slightly, not from fear, but from the complex situation he knew might unfold. As a CIA officer, he had specific protocols to follow during any interaction with law enforcement. These procedures were designed to protect classified information and maintain operational security. But as a black man in America, he had another set of protocols running through his mind, the careful dance of ensuring everyone's comfort and safety during a traffic stop. The officer in the patrol car took their time, presumably running his plates. The intelligence officer used these moments to collect his thoughts and gather his documents. His hand brushed against his CIA credentials in his jacket pocket, the same credentials that he couldn't immediately share without following proper verification procedures. Through his side mirror, he watched the police officer step out of their vehicle. The approaching footsteps were measured, professional. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, and nearby residents were starting to peek out their windows, curious about the scene unfolding on their quiet street. The intelligence officer kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his mind racing through procedures both professional and personal. He'd been in far more dangerous situations overseas, faced down threats that would make most people's blood run cold. Yet there was something uniquely complex about this moment, about the intersection of his identities as a federal agent and a black man, about the delicate balance he would need to strike in the next few minutes. Little did he know, this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. In the next few moments, a series of events would unfold that would not only change his life, but would ultimately spark a conversation that needed to happen in law enforcement agencies and intelligence communities across the country. The approaching officer's flashlight beam swept across his side mirror, and the intelligence officer took a deep breath. Years of training had taught him to stay calm in high-pressure situations, but this one would test every bit of his experience and patience. As the officer's footsteps grew closer, he couldn't have known that this seemingly simple traffic stop would soon become a story that would capture the nation's attention. In that moment, as the officer's knuckles rapped against his window, everything hung in perfect balance, like the split second before a chess piece moves, when all possible futures still exist. What happened next would depend on countless small decisions, unconscious biases, and the ability of two professionals to see beyond their immediate assumptions. The police officer's flashlight beam swept through the Audi's interior, creating dancing shadows across the dashboard. License and registration, came the standard request, delivered in a tone that suggested this was just another traffic stop in a long evening of them. The intelligence officer kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his mind working through multiple scenarios at once. Years of training had taught him to stay 3 steps ahead, but this situation required a delicate balance. "Officer," he began, his voice steady and professional, "I want to cooperate fully, but I need to explain something first." The beam of light shifted slightly, now focusing more intently on his face. The officer's posture changed, subtle, but noticeable to someone trained to read body language. "Sir, I need to see your license and registration first," the officer repeated, their tone firmer this time. "I understand that, officer," the intelligence officer replied, maintaining his calm demeanor. "But I'm required by federal law to follow certain procedures before sharing identification." He could feel the situation beginning to shift, like a car starting to slide on ice. One wrong move could send everything spinning out of control. The officer's hand moved slightly closer to their holster, not drawing, just repositioning. It was an unconscious gesture, one born from countless training sessions about traffic stops gone wrong. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the officer commanded, their voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. Inside the car, the intelligence officer felt his heart rate increase, though his exterior remained composed. This was the moment where things could go either way. He needed to reach for his CIA credentials, but any movement toward his jacket could be misinterpreted. The irony wasn't lost on him. His entire career was built on handling delicate situations, yet here he was, struggling to navigate a traffic stop without setting off alarms. "I'm going to reach very slowly into my left inner jacket pocket," he announced clearly, making each word distinct. "I need to show you something that will explain everything." His hand moved with deliberate slowness, telegraphing every motion. But the officer had seen too many traffic stops go bad, had watched too many training videos where seemingly routine situations turned deadly in seconds. "Hands where I can see them." The command came sharp and loud, cutting through the evening air like a knife. The intelligence officer froze, his fingertips just brushing the leather of his credential holder. Through his open window, he could hear the crackle of a radio as the officer called for backup. The situation was escalating faster than he could control it, like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Neighbors were beginning to gather on their porches, drawn by the raised voices and flashing lights. Someone had their phone out, recording. The intelligence officer knew that within minutes, this scene would likely be streaming live on social media, adding another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. In the distance, more sirens wailed to life. The officer maintaining his position, flashlight beam unwavering. Both hands on the steering wheel, they instructed, voice tight with tension. "Any sudden moves, and—" "Officer," the intelligence officer interrupted, his voice remaining remarkably steady, "what you're about to see in my pocket is a federal badge. I'm trying to follow proper protocol here, but I'd also understand your position. How would you like me to proceed?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. More patrol cars were pulling up now, their red and blue lights painting the quiet Georgetown street in alternating colors. Each new arrival ratcheted up the tension another notch. The intelligence officer could feel sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Not from fear, he'd faced down much worse in his career, but from the sheer frustration of the situation. Here he was, someone who had dedicated his life to protecting his country, being treated like a threat because of circumstances he couldn't even fully explain. Through his sight mirror, he could see at least 3 more officers approaching, their hands hovering near their weapons. The growing audience of neighbors had their phones out now, documenting every second. In his mind, he could already see the potential headlines: "Black federal agent in standoff with police." The thought made his stomach turn. What happened in the next few moments would depend entirely on his ability to navigate an impossible situation, following CIA protocols while dealing with increasingly anxious police officers, all while being conscious of the racial dynamics at play. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this could become exactly the kind of incident that makes national news for all the wrong reasons. As more flashlight beams joined the first, creating a web of light around his vehicle, the intelligence officer took a slow, deep breath. He'd been in worse situations before, had talked his way out of far more dangerous confrontations. But somehow, this felt different. This wasn't about national security or international intrigue. This was about something far more fundamental, about identity, authority, and trust in modern America. The world had shrunk to the width of a beam of light and the cold press of asphalt against his cheek. The intelligence officer found himself face down on the pavement, his carefully pressed suit collecting bits of gravel and street dust. Around him, the red and blue lights continued their silent dance across the Georgetown facades. "I'm going to explain everything," he said clearly, his words measured and calm despite his position. "But I need you to understand that I'm bound by federal law." The weight of a knee pressed into his back, firm but not excessive. At least this officer had been well trained in proper restraint techniques. The growing crowd of onlookers had formed a loose semicircle around the scene, their phone cameras capturing every moment. The intelligence officer could hear their murmured conversations, their hushed speculations. Some were already live streaming, narrating their own versions of events to unseen audiences. "He's got something in his jacket," one of the officers announced, their voice tight with professional concern. The intelligence officer felt hands beginning to pat him down, approaching the pocket containing his CIA credentials. "That's my federal ID," he explained, his voice still remarkably steady. "But there's a proper procedure for verifying it. If you'll allow me to explain." The pressure on his back increased slightly, cutting off his words. A new voice cut through the tension. "Sir, we've run your plates. The vehicle is registered to a government agency, but that's all we're getting. Can't you explain that?" The question came from somewhere above his head, presumably from a superior officer who had just arrived. The intelligence officer almost laughed at the irony. Of course, that's all they were getting. The registration was deliberately obscured to protect agency operations. Everything about this situation was a perfect storm of security protocols colliding with standard police procedure. Through the forest of legs surrounding him, he could see more people gathering. The phones were multiplying like fireflies in the growing darkness, their small screens glowing as they captured what everyone assumed would be another viral video of police confrontation. But this wasn't going to be that kind of story. The intelligence officer had spent years diffusing tense situations in countries where one wrong word could mean disaster. He knew how to handle this. It was just a matter of finding the right words, the right tone, the right moment. "Officers," he began again, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of high-stakes negotiations. "What's about to happen is going to be a bit unusual. When you check my credentials, which you'll find in my left inner jacket pocket, you'll need to make a specific phone call. The number is encoded on the back of the ID. This isn't a standard federal ID verification." He felt the officers exchange glances above him. The knee in his back shifted slightly, but didn't lift. Someone in the crowd shouted something about excessive force, but the intelligence officer knew better. These officers were actually showing remarkable restraint, given what they thought they might be dealing with. "If you'll allow me to roll over very slowly," he continued, "I can show you exactly what I mean. Everything I'm saying will make sense in about 5 minutes." He kept his tone professional, collegial even. This wasn't about asserting authority or resisting. It was about finding a way to follow both sets of protocols without anyone getting hurt. The crowd was growing restless. More voices were rising in protest. The intelligence officer could feel the situation beginning to teeter on the edge of something bigger, something that could easily spiral out of control. He needed to diffuse not just the immediate confrontation, but the growing public tension as well. That's when he heard it, the sound of another vehicle pulling up, this one moving with the kind of purposeful speed that suggested official business. The intelligence officer allowed himself a small smile against the pavement. He had a pretty good idea who that might be. Through the chaos of voices and radio chatter, he heard the distinctive sound of government credentials being presented, followed by a sudden shift in the officer's attention. The knee in his back remained, but he could feel the change in energy around him. "Listen carefully," he said, taking advantage of the momentary pause. "What happens in the next few minutes is going to change how this whole situation looks. But first, I need everyone to stay calm and follow proper procedure. We're about to turn this into a teaching moment, but only if we all keep our heads." The crowd had gone surprisingly quiet, sensing perhaps that this scene wasn't following the usual script. The intelligence officer remained still, face against the pavement, but his mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning how to turn this confrontation into something constructive. Sometimes the worst situations create the best opportunities for change. As he lay there, surrounded by officers and onlookers, the intelligence officer began to see how this entire incident could become something more than just another viral video. It could become a moment of genuine understanding, if they handled it right. The click of heels on pavement cut through the tension like a knife. A commanding voice, crisp and professional, spoke from somewhere beyond the circle of officers. "I can verify this man's identity and position." The words carried the unmistakable weight of authority. The intelligence officer remained still on the ground, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Through the forest of legs around him, he caught a glimpse of polished shoes and the hem of a formal pantsuit. The newcomer must have been at the same briefing. Talk about lucky timing. "Ma'am, this is an active situation," one of the officers began, but the woman cut him off with the practiced ease of someone used to navigating bureaucratic obstacles. "I understand that, officer. I'm the Deputy Director of Operations for the agency this man works for. I have my credentials right here, and I can make a call that will clear this up in about 2 minutes." She paused, then added with just a hint of emphasis, "Unless you prefer, I call the director directly." The intelligence officer felt the pressure on his back ease slightly. Above him, he could hear the rustle of credentials being examined, the quiet murmur of radio conversations. The crowd of onlookers had gone surprisingly quiet, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding. "Sir," the senior officer addressed him now, "we're going to help you up slowly. Keep your hands where we can see them." The knee finally lifted from his back, and strong hands helped him to his feet. As he stood, brushing gravel from his suit, he got his first clear look at the scene around him. The deputy director stood in a pool of streetlight, her government credentials still held out. She looked exactly as she had in the briefing room hours earlier, not a hair out of place, as if arriving at 10th Street confrontations was just another part of her evening routine. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their phones still recording every moment. But now there were confused murmurs rippling through the gathering. This wasn't following the usual script of such encounters, and everyone could feel it. "If you'll allow me," the intelligence officer said, slowly reaching for his jacket. This time, no one stopped him. He carefully extracted his CIA credentials, handling them with the reverence of someone who understood exactly what they represented. "These will need to be verified through a specific channel." The senior officer took the credentials, studying them with intense focus. The holographic security features caught the strobing lights of the police cars, sending tiny rainbows dancing across his face. "I've never seen this type before," he admitted. "That's because they're not meant to be seen," the deputy director explained, stepping closer. "What you're holding represents years of service to this country, most of which will never be publicly acknowledged." She turned to address the other officers. "Your dashcams picked up everything, correct?" The officers nodded, some looking slightly confused about where this was heading. The intelligence officer could see the wheels turning in their heads, trying to process how a routine traffic stop had turned into whatever this was. "Good," the deputy director continued, "because what happened here tonight is about to become a teaching moment for both our agencies." She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. "I'm sending an email right now that will start that process. But first, we need to clear this scene." The intelligence officer watched as she took control of the situation with the kind of supple authority that couldn't be taught. No raised voice, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how to navigate complex situations. Some of the onlookers were starting to drift away, perhaps disappointed that the confrontation was resolving peacefully. Others stayed, sensing that they were witnessing something unusual, something that defied the usual narratives. "Officer," the intelligence officer addressed the one who had first pulled him over, "I owe you an explanation. And I'd like to give it to you properly, if you're willing to listen." He held out his hand, a gesture that seemed to surprise everyone present. The street had grown quieter now, the tension draining away like air from a balloon. Even the red and blue lights seemed less harsh, less urgent. What remained was a group of professionals suddenly faced with an opportunity to learn from each other. The deputy director watched this exchange with approval, already seeing the potential for something positive to emerge from what could have been a disastrous situation. "Gentlemen," she said, "I suggest we continue this conversation somewhere more private. What happened here tonight could help prevent similar incidents in the future." As the crowd finally began to disperse, the intelligence officer felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not just the physical tension of the confrontation, but something deeper, the constant burden of navigating between different worlds, different expectations, different protocols. Maybe, just maybe, this incident could help bridge some of those gaps. The precinct's break room wasn't designed for moments like this. Its fluorescent lights and worn furniture usually witnessed hurried coffee breaks and quick shift changes. But tonight, it became the setting for something extraordinary. The intelligence officer sat across from the officer who had pulled him over, both men's coffee cups steaming between them. The deputy director had insisted on this meeting, then stepped back to let them talk. Sometimes, she knew, the best leadership meant creating space for others to find their own understanding. "I want to start by saying something," the officer began, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. "What you did out there, staying calm, trying to explain, that couldn't have been easy." His words carried the weight of genuine reflection. The intelligence officer nodded, taking a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "And what you did was exactly what you're trained to do. That's what makes this situation so complex." He leaned forward slightly. "Let me tell you about my first day at Langley." For the next hour, they talked, really talked. The intelligence officer shared stories about serving his country while constantly navigating the complexities of his identity. He explained how every traffic stop, every airport security check, every routine interaction carried an extra layer of tension because of the secrets he was bound to protect. "It's like wearing two masks," he explained, gesturing with his coffee cup. "One because of my job, and one because of how the world sees me. And sometimes, like tonight, those masks collide." The officer listened, really listened, then shared his own perspective. He talked about the weight of the badge, the split-second decisions, the way every traffic stop carried the possibility of danger. "But hearing your side," he admitted, "makes me think about how many times I might have misread a situation." Other officers drifted in and out of the break room, drawn by the unusual scene. Some stayed, adding their own perspectives to the conversation. The night shift supervisor canceled the usual briefing, recognizing that something more important was happening in that cramped break room. "You know what the hardest part is?" the intelligence officer asked, now addressing the small group that had gathered. "It's not the big moments. It's the small daily calculations. Which rules do I follow when they conflict? How do I protect both my safety and national security? How do I honor both my oath to the agency and my identity as a black man in America?" The room fell quiet, absorbing his words. One of the veteran officers spoke up, his voice carrying years of street experience. "We've got protocols too, but hearing you talk, maybe we need to think about how those protocols interact with other realities." The conversation shifted to practical matters. They discussed how to handle similar situations in the future, how to recognize the signs of federal agents operating under constraints, how to balance security protocols with public safety. But it went deeper than procedures and protocols. They talked about assumptions, about the weight of history, about the possibility of change. The intelligence officer shared stories from his international operations, drawing parallels between building trust in foreign territories and building it on American streets. "In my line of work," he explained, pouring himself a second cup of coffee, "we learn that the smallest interactions can have the biggest impact. Tonight could have gone very differently. But instead of a confrontation, we're having a conversation." The officer who had initially pulled him over nodded slowly. "You know, we're trained to look for threats, to maintain control of situations. But maybe sometimes control looks different than we think." As midnight approached, the deputy director returned to find the break room transformed into something between a classroom and a community forum. Officers were sharing experiences, asking questions, proposing changes to training procedures. "This," she said quietly to the intelligence officer, "is how real change happens, not through mandates from above, but through conversations like this." Looking around the room, the intelligence officer saw something he hadn't expected when he'd first seen those flashing lights in his rearview mirror: hope. Not the grand, sweeping kind that makes headlines, but the quiet, persistent kind that grows through understanding. "You know what we should do?" one of the younger officers suggested, energized by the discussion. "We should turn this into something bigger. Not just a story about what went wrong, but about what went right. About how we found a way to understand each other." The intelligence officer smiled, remembering something his first CIA trainer had told him: sometimes the best operations are the ones where nothing explodes, where no shots are fired, where the only thing that changes are the thoughts in people's heads. The small conference room buzzed with energy as police officers and federal agents crowded around a large table. 6 weeks had passed since that night in Georgetown, and what had started as a tense traffic stop had grown into something none of them could have predicted. The intelligence officer stood at the front of the room, his suit as crisp as ever, but his demeanor more relaxed than that night on the pavement. Beside him, the officer who had pulled him over was pointing to a PowerPoint slide showing their new joint training protocol. "So here's what we learned," the police officer explained to the gathered group. "When federal agents are operating under classified protocols, they might not be able to immediately comply with standard traffic stop procedures. But there are signs we can look for, ways we can verify their status without compromising security." The intelligence officer nodded, picking up the thread. "And on our side, we've developed new guidelines for our agents, ways to signal their status to law enforcement while maintaining operational security." He clicked to the next slide. "It's about finding that middle ground between keeping our secrets and keeping everyone safe." Around the table, heads nodded. Some were taking notes, others were already discussing how to implement these ideas in their own departments. The deputy director sat quietly in the back, watching her initial hunch play out. Sometimes the best solutions come from the people closest to the problem. "Here's the thing," the police officer continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "This isn't just about federal agents and traffic stops. It's about learning to look beyond our first assumptions, about understanding that situations aren't always what they seem." The intelligence officer stepped forward. "In my work overseas, we have a saying, the first story is rarely the whole story." That night could have been just another viral video, another headline about conflict between law enforcement and the black community. Instead, it became a catalyst for change. He clicked to a new slide showing statistics from their pilot program. "In the past month alone, we've had 3 incidents where officers recognized the signs we identified. 3 potentially volatile situations that instead ended with professional courtesy and mutual respect." A hand went up in the back. "But how do we scale this? How do we take what you two learned and make it work across the country?" The police officer smiled. "That's actually my favorite part of this story." He walked to a cabinet and pulled out a stack of manuals. "We've documented everything. The protocols, the training exercises, the real-world examples. But more importantly, we've created a framework for having these difficult conversations." The intelligence officer took one of the manuals, running his hand over the cover. "You know what makes this different from other training programs? It's not about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about understanding each other's perspectives, about finding ways to work together even when our protocols seem to conflict." The deputy director finally spoke up from her corner. "What these gentlemen have created goes beyond just improving interactions between law enforcement and federal agents. They've developed a model for handling complex encounters of all kinds." Around the table, people were already starting to see the broader applications. A senior officer from another precinct spoke up. "We could adapt this for interactions with diplomatic personnel, foreign officials, even situations involving language barriers or cultural differences." The intelligence officer nodded. "Exactly. Because at its core, this isn't about specific protocols or procedures. It's about learning to pause, to listen, to look for the story behind the story." The police officer added, "And it's about understanding that everyone we encounter is navigating their own complex set of rules and responsibilities. Sometimes, like that night in Georgetown, those rules seem to conflict with ours. But there's almost always a way forward if we're willing to look for it." As the meeting continued, more ideas emerged. Officers shared their own experiences, offered suggestions for improvement, proposed new scenarios to consider. The energy in the room was palpable. This wasn't just another mandatory training session, but something real, something that had grown from actual experience. The intelligence officer caught the eye of the officer who had pulled him over that night. They shared a small nod, both thinking about how far they'd come from that tense moment on a Georgetown street. What could have been a disaster had instead become a blueprint for change. "You know what the best part is?" The police officer addressed the room. "This isn't just theory. We lived this. We know it works because we've seen it work. And every person in this room has the power to take these ideas and make them real in their own communities." As the meeting wound down, participants lingered, forming small groups to continue the discussion. The manual they'd created wasn't just another procedural document destined to gather dust on a shelf. It was a living document filled with real experiences and practical solutions, ready to grow and evolve as others added their own insights. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel was packed with an unusual mix of people. Police officers in dress uniforms sat next to federal agents in suits. Community leaders mingled with government officials. Local media crews set up their cameras at the back of the room. The intelligence officer adjusted his tie as he stood backstage, glancing at his notes one last time. Beside him, the police officer who had pulled him over that night was doing the same thing, though his nervous energy showed in the way he kept straightening his already perfect uniform. "Ready for this?" the intelligence officer asked with a slight smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," the officer replied. "Still feels surreal, doesn't it? All of this from one traffic stop." Through the curtain, they could hear the deputy director finishing her introduction. What started as a potentially volatile situation has become a model for change across the country. To date, over 50 police departments have adopted their training program, and the results speak for themselves. The two men stepped onto the stage to warm applause. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience, but they could feel the energy in the room. This wasn't just another law enforcement conference. This was something different, something new. 1 year ago, the intelligence officer began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "I was face down on a Georgetown street, trying to figure out how to follow two sets of protocols that seemed completely opposed to each other." A knowing chuckle rippled through the crowd. The police officer stepped forward, and I was standing over him, trying to maintain control of a situation that I didn't fully understand. He paused, letting that sink in. But what happened next changed not just our lives, but the lives of countless others. They took turns sharing the story, but not just the tense moments from that night. They talked about the conversations that followed, the late-night discussions in the precinct break room, the gradual building of trust and understanding. In the past year, the intelligence officer continued, clicking to a new slide. Departments using our training program have reported a 60% decrease in escalated encounters. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The police officer nodded. The real change is happening in daily interactions. It's happening in the small moments when officers pause to consider that there might be more to the situation than what they first see. They shared stories from other departments. A traffic stop involving a diplomat that could have gone wrong, but didn't. A late-night encounter with an undercover agent that ended in professional courtesy instead of confrontation. A tense situation with a non-English speaker that was diffused through newly learned techniques. "But here's what really matters," the intelligence officer said, his voice softening slightly. "We're not just changing procedures, we're changing perspectives." He looked out at the audience. Every person in this room has the power to turn a potential confrontation into a conversation. The police officer stepped forward again. "We've learned that authority doesn't have to mean rigidity. That following protocol doesn't mean we can't also show understanding. That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is take a moment to listen." They clicked to their final slide, showing a photo from that night in Georgetown. The street lit by police lights, people gathered with their phones out. "This could have been just another viral video," the intelligence officer said quietly. Instead, it became a turning point. The deputy director joined them on stage, bringing with her a surprise. "The Attorney General couldn't be here today," she announced, but she sensed something special. She unveiled a framed commendation, recognizing their work in building bridges between law enforcement and federal agencies. But the real moment came during the queue and a session that followed. A young officer stood up, her voice slightly shaky with emotion. "I was in that crowd that night," she said. "I was one of the people recording with my phone, expecting to witness just another confrontation. But what I saw instead, it changed how I approach my job every day." As the conference wound down, people lined up to share their own stories, to ask questions, to offer suggestions for expanding the program. The intelligence officer and the police officer stayed late, talking with everyone who wanted to speak with them. "You know what's funny?" the police officer said later, as they were packing up their materials. "That night, I thought I was just doing my job, following procedure. Now I realize every interaction is a chance to do something more." The intelligence officer nodded, thinking about all the places his career had taken him, all the delicate situations he navigated. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. As they left the hotel that evening, they passed a group of new police recruits arriving for the next day's training session. The future of law enforcement, eager to learn, ready to see beyond their first assumptions. And somewhere in their training materials was the story of a traffic stop in Georgetown that became something more. A reminder that even the most tense situations can become opportunities for change when handled with wisdom, patience, and mutual respect.